Here we are with Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs Asset Management. Okay, thank you so much for coming to our studios, Jim.
My pleasure to be here.
You're known to be the founder of BRICS, the famous BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. How are they doing?
They're all going through a few challenges at the moment, actually, which is quite interesting. It's making some people think that the whole story is over, but...
So the era is not over?
No, not in the slightest. As I'm fond of saying to people, in the year that we've started, collectively, they will create close to another Italy between them in 1 year. And by 2015, they will almost definitely be collectively bigger than the US.
So why are people bearish about the BRICS?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's partly because the stock markets went down last year. In 20, it was a big decline in all four of them, close to 20% across the board. So that caused a lot of pain for people that invested in them. But if people think the BRIC story requires the BRIC equity markets to rise every year, then they're being very naive. But each of them have got various challenges, but the BRIC story is nowhere near over. It continues to be quite easily the most important strategic positive development of the world economy of our generation.
Nice to hear. We heard also that there are some new additions. We heard that you find Turkey to be attractive. Is it going to be a new addition to BRICS?
It's very funny, should it become bricked with
BRICS, exactly. Yes.
I don't think I'd go quite that far.
Okay.
What I have done in it, and it's got misconstrued in many of the world's media, is that I'm trying to find a way to persuade investors to stop thinking of some of these places as traditional emerging markets.
Okay.
And so I call them growth markets, and all four of the BRICS definitely should be regarded that way. But I've also come to the conclusion that a number of other important emerging countries, including Turkey, should be regarded as one of those. And so,
why so?
Because I think any economy that's at least 1% of global GDP or more should be regarded as reasonably grown up, and its future depends on itself rather than being one of these risky emerging economy types. And Turkey's one of those, but it's not big enough to be regarded as a BRIC. But
what does it need to have to be big enough to go into BRIC?
In my sort of reasonably simplistic judgment, it has to be conceivable to see it being at least 3% of global GDP. And that is not so easy to see in the foreseeable future for Turkey. But by that I mean the next decade or beyond.
Okay, so let's talk about the global side. How important, or are those downgrades important nowadays that's happening? EFSF downgrading and such.
I think it's symbolic. In this particular case, the downgrades were effectively telegraphed for France back in December. So in that sense, these downgrades are the most discounted downgrades that I think I've ever professionally seen in my life. So one of the reasons the markets haven't reacted negatively is because everybody knew it was coming. What happens going forward as a response to it in terms of economic policy in Europe and what follows, that's what's now important. The downgrades, not relevant in my opinion.
And do you see the Greek default, and if yes, how are the assets going to be priced?
I think unfortunately it is very difficult to avoid the conclusion that Greece can get through without a default. Whether that's going to be messy and have significant contagion for the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, and maybe for Turkey, that's a lot harder to have a confident view on. It could be bad, but if European policymakers have kind of had a little bit of a war room experiment, we have been talking about this Turkish thing for a long time.
That's right.
It doesn't necessarily have to be bad. I mean, I've been around long enough to know where in some cases where the risk of a default has hung over markets, and when it's happened, it's actually cleared the air. Argentina, in that sense, people worried about the consequences of the Argentinian default back in the 1990s, and it didn't have contagion for the rest of the world. It seemed to be the beginning of a better environment. So maybe that getting that situation out of the way, so we stop focusing on it so much, maybe it'd be a good thing.
Let's come to this side of the world, in the US. You're here now. We heard that you're very bullish about the US economy, and Fed indicated it may begin targeting inflation this year.
Yeah.
And if you also take the World Watch on inflation targeting, the US job market has shown improvement. What is your view on the US economy? Positive
Well, I don't think I'd call myself very, very bullish. I'm certainly bullish relative to the consensus. I think the US is getting a few of its problem areas solved. I think the housing market problem is closer to the end than the beginning. Big developments going on with US energy policy, which are quite positive. And as you touched on in your question, from where I sit, I think inflation targeting as a principle of macroeconomic policy is a pretty sound thing to do, and I think it would be good for the Fed to do that. Very transparent, pretty clearly explainable to people, and I think it would be a wise thing for the Fed to do.
And in terms of the global inflation targets, do you see any other countries following the same path?
You know, I would love bringing it back to the BRICS. I keep trying to persuade some Indian policymakers when I meet them that it would be a good thing for India to do. India prides itself on being the world's biggest democracy, and inflation targeting is a pretty democratic thing to do, in my judgment. And
how about China?
China has an inflation target. Interesting. Not obviously a democracy in the defined way that we all know, but inflation targeting is something that the Chinese authorities do, and it's what's been driving them for the past 12 months.
How about China's growth numbers that came, and then we saw a rally in the stock markets because of the landing, the soft landing, and the stimulus bets? Yeah. What do you say to that?
I'm in the soft landing camp, so you know it's no surprise to me that the first bit of better than expected news causes the positive response we've seen. It seems to me people have got far too worried about the so-called hard landing. I think it's very unlikely. And I think China's adjusting pretty well.
We heard today that there will be stimulus in 2 continents. One of them maybe being here and one of them being over there in Europe. Do you expect the same? Do you expect Fed to go for QE3?
I think the message from the Fed on QE3 is pretty clear that they'll do it if it's necessary. It's not obvious to me that they need to rush to do it because the economy is showing signs of improvement. So I think it's clear from the people that matter at the Fed, particularly Bernanke, but maybe 1 or 2 other governors, including the New York Fed one. They've said that if they need to do it, they'll do it. Whether they actually need to do it or not remains open to be seen. If the economy keeps on improving, maybe they won't need to.
And last question. As you said, the economy is improving, but everything is also dependent on the European sovereign debt crisis. If there are any surprises, do you expect any surprises?
I'm going to disagree with you. I think that's a bit of a myth. The European debt crisis is a big problem. It's a big problem for Europe. I don't understand why everybody thinks that everybody else around the rest of the world's future depends on Europe, because I don't think it's true.
It doesn't?
The US's economic future depends on the US, not on Europe.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.